Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And if you're new to the channel, a few new people have seen the shorts and that we've been putting up recently. Welcome aboard. All the information you always need is in the description below. That's where you'll find links to our merchandise, how to support us on Patreon or YouTube membership, etc., etc., etc. But without further ado, who were the 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and why were they called the Ghost Army? Well, joining me is my friend Rick Beyer, author of this fab book, links are in the description below, Ghost Army, to talk about it. So I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Rick. How are you today?
I'm great, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm good. So, the Ghost Army, it's been part of your life for
19 years. It's been part of my life for 19 years.
Wow.
We were both in junior high school, I think, when I started working in the Ghost Army.
Yeah, and you know, it's a story that keeps on going because people love the idea of deceiving the enemy and creativity and this outside the box thinking that the Allies are supposedly masters of. And this is what that story encapsulates. We'll get into it later on about the complexities of it and the results of it. But how did you, before we bring up your slides, how did you first come across it? Because you're a filmmaker, historian, battlefield guy, and everything. But when did it first come into your world, apart from being at school?
So it was 19 years ago, and I got an email from my former business partner, Mark, and he said, hey, I met this woman. We serve on a board together, and her uncle was in this crazy World War II unit that nobody's ever heard of. They did deception on the battlefields of Europe, and she thinks that somebody ought to make a documentary film about this. And I said, oh, you know, I'm a filmmaker. We could meet. And so I met her. Her name was Martha Gavin. And I met her at a Starbucks, and she carried into the Starbucks an armload of 3-ring binders, and they contained her uncle's wartime scrapbooks. So it was, you know, photos, and it was ephemera, and it was artworks, because there were a lot of artists in this unit, and he was one of them. And so this was my first introduction to the story of the Ghost Army, and I got hooked pretty quickly and started working on making a film, and kind of things took off from there. And I'm not sure I'm ever going to get out of this. I think I'm stuck with it for the rest of my life at this point.
Well, I think you are. And, you know, just to plug the book there are historians I deal with on this channel, and you do on your own YouTube show, you do with Chris Anderson for Stephen Ambrose tours, is that a lot of people just spend their time with History Happy Hour, with dusty archives of just types. That what you found and was just incredible artwork and drawings and sketches and full color plates. It must have been a joy to do some of that research with the material you were discovering.
Well, it's been incredible, and you know, and it's come little bit by little bit. So this unit was involved in deception, and I think I can forward here. And some of these are photos that are black and white photos that we've colorized, but they carry out deception on the battlefields of Europe, and they are using visual deception, sound deception, and radio deception. So the visual deception are these incredible inflatables. Hundreds and hundreds of them that they had, of everything that an armored division or an infantry division would have on their equipment list. When I show this slide, Paul, it's a 2.5-ton truck, and then I say, how many trucks are in this picture? There's a silent moment of the audience. I say 3 trucks, 2 are still in bags. I always get a laugh at that. And look, I got a laugh from you, even though it's like a groaning laugh.
I did laugh. I will laugh at anything, but that was funny. It did make me laugh.
This is a photograph from an actual deception they did called Operation Viersen in March 1945. Every vehicle in this picture is inflated. And this is maybe 10 miles behind the Rhine River. They are portraying the 30th and 79th Divisions getting ready to cross the Rhine River in one spot where they're actually going to cross 10 miles away. So this was their last deception. They did 22 deceptions in Northern Europe, starting a week after D-Day. So it has nothing to do with the Fortitude D-Day deception, completely different story, and going to the end of the war. And it was an American Army unit. So, you know, we can get into who does deception better, the British with their floating bodies and all the different stuff that they did, or the Americans with the Ghost Army. But you know, so these are some of the images that you see. This is the visual deception. And this is as I said, there's many artists in the unit. I'm sorry, I'm talking away now. I can keep going.
Keep going.
If that's okay.
We
Yeah,
love
yeah.
it.
So this was a part of an artwork done by Arthur Shillstone, and it's one of the stories he told. Is being early on in the war, they were setting up their inflatables for the first time. They put out a security perimeter, and somehow a couple of Frenchmen on bicycles got through the security perimeter, and Arthur's trying to shoot them away. And as he said, they're not looking at me; they're looking over my shoulder, and what they thought they saw was four GIs lifting up a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. And he said they were looking at me, they were looking for answers. And finally, I said, the Americans are very strong. So that's, I'll stop for a minute, but that's one of the three types of deception that they go to war with is the visual deception. And the number of photos that were in the scrapbooks of veterans of visual deception was pretty small, but somebody would have one and somebody would have another one. And then the National Archives had some. And then there was another place at the National Archives I didn't find the first time and they had more. And then, so now I've built up, and then I purchased, I got an email one day from Helen Patton, who I know you know. And she said, Hans, my friend, has found this collection of photos of dummies, but he thinks somebody should buy it. It's for sale. And, he's not ready to buy it, but you might be interested. And it was this collection of 90 photographs of inflatables. And I had seen 2 of them before.
Wow.
And it was extraordinary. And I did purchase this collection, and they were never declassified. They still had the classification markings on them. They weren't crossed off at all. We actually had a conference with our lawyer. Can we buy these? Are we violating a law because they might still be classified? And we purchased them. And if the FBI comes into the room while I'm talking to you, we finally.
I see a red dot on your forehead. Yeah, well, we all run. We were not here. Yeah,
all the little lasers, and so yeah. There's a tremendous amount of material that I've gathered over the years.
And there were always people discussing in the sidebar about visual deception. The thing is, deception isn't new. I mean, going back to classic wars, there were examples of people using reflections and mirages and all that kind of stuff to deceive enemy people. It was the turning it into a sort of science that World War II kind of gave us, and bringing in the right kind of people, because the cliche about this unit is that it's not a cliche. It was Hollywood, set builders, people who understood force perception and how to alter things. So it's how did it all come about? What was the fruition of this particular unit? Who was the main guy who started all?
Well, I gotta whip forward in these slides here to show the picture of that. So I'm just can I do that? Can I?
Yeah.
Zip here. Oh, back one. And so the 2 guys who dreamed up this unit were 2 American officers, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And what's great about this story is they are total opposites. So Ralph Ingersoll was a celebrity left-wing author, journalist. You guys would have been great pals. He was involved in Fortune magazine, the New Yorker magazine. He started his own newspaper in New York. The New York Times called him a prodigiously energetic egotist. He had met Roosevelt. He had met, Stalin. He'd done all this stuff. But he's drafted. He's ended up serving as a staff officer. And eventually he finds himself in the Special Plans branch of the European Theater of Operations. And he's under Colonel Billy Harris. And Billy Harris is the exact opposite of Ralph Ingersoll. He's his entire family, went to West Point. His father went to West Point, his uncle, his brother, they all become generals. Billy becomes a general eventually. And that family is so military that Billy Harris's mother is the person who introduced Dwight Eisenhower to Mamie Dowd. Okay. 30 years before World War II. So, they are very military. So these 2 guys end up working together, and they are the guys who developed the idea of the Ghost Army. This is in late 43 in London. They've been working, coordinating some of the fortitude plans in the American parts of that. They're coming up with chicken feed to give to Garbo and his phony networks. And Ingersoll comes up with this idea he calls them my con artists for this deception unit. So he's kind of the wild idea, pie in the sky guy. And Billy Harris is the feet on the ground. How do we make this work with the military guy? And it's the 2 of them together who develop this. And what I think is cool about that, Paul, is that it's the power of thinking in working with somebody who thinks differently than you.
Yeah.
Right. So under normal circumstances, these guys wouldn't have had a cup of coffee. They probably would have they did look at each other with a little bit of distrust. And yet they're thrown together and they figure out a way to make it work. And I think that's, if you work with somebody who thinks differently than you, there's going to be friction, but that friction creates heat and that can light the spark and make something go.
Yeah. And, we'll be carrying on this conversation about how it then develops beyond that. But I'm always thinking as a Normandy guy that the whole basis of the success of Operation Overlord is that we have these many, what I call force multipliers. So we're using this ability we have to take hundreds of thousands of aerial photos, to use the ultra decrypts we're using. The idea is that when our troops hit those beaches and start fighting through inland, and we can apply this to Italy as well, is that they have got every available asset to them and they add them all together. And it's going to give the Allies a little bit more of a chance to come out victorious than the enemy. It's about fine margins, isn't it? Because I think we were talking before going live, Rick, about in the modern interpretation, these dirty tricks the Allies employ, they always are rather oversold, aren't they? Operation Mincemeat, it's the event, the deception that changed the course of World War II. And it probably wasn't. It helped other people have an advantage in shifting the outcome of World War II, but individually these things don't necessarily do it. But I'm digressing now.
Well, but let me respond to it because that's an interesting point. I mean, if you put yourself in as a planner in late 43, early 1944, in London, you're planning this ginormous invasion everybody's gathered for. You're trying literally to come up with anything that can give you an advantage. And your thought is, here we are going up against the Germans, who are the best army in the world, or so we thought at the time. And you can make the argument that they were. We are going to be landing people on these beaches. They are going to be able to bring more force to those beaches in the early days. If we don't deceive them, then we do. So we just need every advantage we can get. And I think that it was really only in that set of circumstances that all these crazy plans could have been adopted. And, I mean, the thing is that if you're trying to judge how successful something was, and we can talk more about this, it's like if it saved 10 lives, was it successful? I mean, it certainly would have been for those 10 people. They would all really appreciate that you did that. If it saved 1,000 lives, or if it saved 10,000 lives, suddenly you're saying, yeah, it was a super success. But you don't know going in, what thing is going to work, or where something is going to give you just that tiniest little advantage, that half step against a defender, let's say, in a ball game, that's going to make the whole difference and win you the championship. So you go in and try and see what works.
Yeah, we're already getting questions. So, one, to begin with, people love the finance. How much did this whole program cost? Because when I said at the beginning, 1,100 individuals, that's not very many in terms of people. That's a large battalion of infantry, isn't it, in terms of numbers? But the money behind this must have been extraordinary.
Well, I don't think it cost that much. If you think about it, compared to, manufacturing actual tanks, if you've got multiple rubber factories and they're making all sorts of dummy tanks, but think about the comparison of the cost of, is 100 dummy tanks to the price of one real tank. I mean, you can ship all your rubber dummies over to Europe for the price of shipping a couple of real tanks over. So I don't think that the dollar amount is that excessive. I think that the risk, the gamble here is not about the money. It's a little bit about the lives, although 1,100 lives is not a lot to put at risk. But then the gamble is that if the enemy figures out what you're doing and can use that information to their advantage, then if they could recognize your deception unit, if they found the telltale signal that said, oh, this was the Ghost Army operating here, then they would be able to say, okay, if we see the Ghost Army operating, that's where we know there's no actual American troops, and so we can apply there. So that's the risk that is created in this. And I think that either through luck or through great skill, and maybe both, they don't figure it out, and so that never becomes an issue for the Americans.
Well, that's a very good point. Well, we've had a great question or comment coming from History Explorer Rob saying, and it's perhaps a good point to then go a bit deeper into how this whole thing worked. He's saying psychological warfare, influence activity must be credibly resourced. The inflatable army had to be complemented with sig int, imint, humint, etc. So this has to be part of a package. Just having people, blow up inflatable tanks and stick them in a field is only one very tiny part of this whole thing. So kind of break down how this whole package works, what this unit does for us.
Right. So you're absolutely correct in that question, and it's a great thought, and it's a great way to push us forward. First of all, why do you use deception on the battlefield? You use deception so that you can manipulate what the enemy is doing. If I can make the enemy move their troops over here because they think that way over here is where I'm really going to attack, and then I can attack here, that is kind of the purpose of deception. And to do that, so you have to have a story. You have to have a fake story that you're trying to get the enemy to believe. And it has to be something that they're willing to believe, right? It has to be something that kind of corresponds with their opinion of you and their opinion of the situation. But you come up with that story, and then you're putting out all different clues. So the visual deception is one clue, and it's you've camouflaged these inflatables, but they're camouflaged a little badly so the enemy can see them. But they go to war with two other types of deception to fit into that. And the first one is sonic deception, and that's the picture I threw up here. This is using recorded sounds to fool the enemy. So before they went to Europe, they recorded onto sound effects records the sounds of truck convoys on the move, the sounds of tanks on the move, the sounds of bridge building, anything that involves the preparation and movement of troops. And then for any particular deception, they could mix the sounds together to match the story that they're trying to convince the enemy and play them from these 500-pound speakers mounted on the back of half tracks. And these speakers were tested, and they had a range of 10 to 15 miles, but oftentimes the Army would push the sonic guys way up front. So they would sometimes be a quarter of a mile from the front line, a mile from the front line. They'd be pretty close, and they're playing these sounds, and it was incredibly effective. There's all sorts of testimony from other American units who heard this and believed in different operations that tanks were moving in, that stuff was happening. And so that is another part of the deception. And this is another picture of one of the speakers on top of the half tracks. These were played, by the way, on a wire. If you know what I mean, it's a magnetized wire. It's the predecessor of the tape recorder, which was magnetized tape. This is magnetized wire. It's the consistency of fishing line. If I was holding it here, you couldn't see it. So pretend I'm holding it. And about 2 miles of that is about 30 minutes of sound. So they're doing sonic deception and visual deception. And the third type of deception they go to war with is radio deception. And this is one of the radio deceivers, Stanley Nance. And radio deception is pretty easy, right? So this is World War II. We're not communicating by cell phone. We're communicating by radio, usually using Morse code. So if we can have a phony radio network with all the same number of radios that the 5th Armored Division would have, it's going to make it seem to the enemy who's listening in on the frequencies that the 5th Armored Division is actually moving in. And then when you get to the spot at the front where you're trying to say the 5th is moving to, you tie in with the real radio networks there. And so these three things all have to support the same story. And you start with the radio because that's the one that you can hear the longest distance away, and then the sound, then the visual. And so if the enemy is looking to any of those things, he's getting this clue and this clue and this clue. You're then depending on the enemy intelligence officer to take these different pieces, and maybe he doesn't even see all of them, but puts them together and says, aha, I have figured out what the Americans are doing. They are moving a unit over here. They don't want us to know, but I have been able to discern this by listening, by watching. And so he really believes that he's developed this idea. And so it's always easier to convince somebody of something if they feel like they came up with the idea themselves. And so that's the kind of the three types of deception they went to war with. Then they're there in Normandy, and then later in Brittany, and then of course onward in Europe, and they develop a fourth type of deception because basically they realize something's missing, And it's the junior officers who figure it out, especially a guy named Fred Fox, a young officer, which is that they need to kind of be more theatrical. And so they develop a fourth type of deception called special effects. And yeah, so special effects involve putting on phony patches on your uniform. So if you're pretending to be the 26th Division, you put a Yankee Division patch on your uniform. You put markings on your trucks. You drive them back and forth through the town. You give the guys stories of being in the 26th Division that they can drop if they're buying something in a market or talking with people. And to do this, they created counterfeit shoulder patches. And this is a guy, Seymour Nussenbaum. He's still alive. He's 100, and I think he's going to turn 101 in June. He and a bunch of other guys, half a dozen other guys, created about 40,000 fake patches during the war, painting them using stencils, doing it by hand on tent canvas. And the reason they're creating fake ones is because, hey, it's the U.S. Army. We can't call them up and say, hey, ship out 1,000 patches from this division today. It doesn't quite work that way. So they had to be able to make them themselves. But this went even further, the special effects, and I love some of the stuff they did. They would set up phony headquarters. This is an actual photo of a phony headquarters from Operation Viersen, their last mission. And we have more photographs from Viersen than of other deceptions, and I think it's because it's the end of the war and things are starting to loosen up a little bit. But this is a phony headquarters for the 119th Regiment, which was in the 30th Division. You can see the code name over the door, Crisis. You can see 119th on the Jeep. The MP is in the markings on his helmet and everything match what the MPs from the 30th Division wore. And they had a fake commander. So they had a captain in the Ghost Army named George Reb. He was a year and a half out of West Point, and he puts on colonels, full colonels, eagle, and he's there impersonating a colonel. And this is in March 1945, and they're 10 miles behind the front line. And at some point, a couple of other American officers pull up in a Jeep. They're lost. They're looking for something. And they go in and they run into Reb. Well, these guys were at West Point the same time George Reb was. They, in fact, were a year ahead of George Reb. He was a cadet when they left. Now they're captains, and he's a colonel. And they're like, what is going on here? How'd you get to be a colonel? But they don't actually want to ask him because it's embarrassing. So they ask his sergeant as they're leaving. They say, how did Reb get to be a colonel so fast? And the sergeant basically says, fortunes of war. And George told me that story, but that's the fourth type of deception that they use. So you mix these four types of deception together, and hopefully you are able to convince the enemy, get them to sign on to your plan, and then you're off and running.
Brilliant stuff. So someone has to know at a high level that this unit exists. So we had the question from Jeff earlier saying, who was the 23rd's patron in Ike's headquarters? So Ike has to be aware that this is an asset he has, and that I'm using Ike, but the commanders, and then they can say, well, can you try and convince the Germans that we're doing this because actually what we're doing is this? So this unit has to know at least part of what the real plan is to be able to put together the fake plan. Yes, am I
yeah.
correct?
So the answer is, so Ingersoll and Harris continue to be involved in as they are running the special plans branch for General Omar Bradley. I mean, there's a little bit of confusion here because at first they're working for Eisenhower, but then once American troops are in France and enough of them are there, they become part of 12th U.S. Army Group. And so they are always with Bradley's headquarters. When he moves to Luxembourg, they're in Luxembourg. And they are kind of the conduit for deceptions. So Bradley is very involved. I mean, there's testimony from Ingersoll that there were times when he talked to Bradley about deceptions. Ingersoll met with Patton when they were doing a deception for Patton's Third Army. So we know that Patton and Bradley were real familiar with this. And there are memos that go out from Eisenhower's headquarters about it at a couple of different times. So I definitely think Eisenhower's aware of it, but I don't think he's very involved in the actual creation of plans. I think that's really happening from the Special Plans branch, working for Omar Bradley, right? So they understand what the overall plan is, what the direction is, and so they can then create the scenarios. And there's a lot more scenarios that get created for potential deceptions that don't get carried out because we're moving so fast at times that you develop an idea, and then it's like the airborne, where they would say, we're going to land here, and then on that day American troops have already gotten to that spot. So the same thing happens with deception.
So my next question, which kind of brings us back to something we were saying earlier, is the results. So if you're an artillery unit, and Rob is watching, who's an artillery officer, and his unit gets told to paste that bridge out, to give the coordinates and knock that bridge out, and you lay a stonk on that bridge, and you can see through your binoculars that the bridge is knocked out. That's it. You've done your job. The bridge is knocked out. How does this unit have any idea whether or not what they're doing is being followed, noticed, reacted to by the Germans, unless you get the absolute result where a German unit suddenly rushes somewhere and you can, that must be because of this. How do you know when it's working? How do you know when to stop? How do you know when you can back off on something?
Yeah, so a lot of times they didn't know in the spot, and so they're making educated guesses. They're trying to keep the deception short. Most of them are 2, 3, 4 days long. We have some clues that came in certain deceptions. So let's say in Operation Brest, where they were impersonating the 6th Armored Division because the 6th Armored had already moved out of the Brest area. When they interviewed German prisoners later, they believed the 6th Armored was still there. So that's a sign. There were a couple of deceptions where captured German maps showed the position of a division in the spot where the Ghost Army was pretending to be that division. But that information usually came later. So in the moment, they don't have a lot of real-time feedback. There may have been one soldier in this unit who was privy to Ultra. That still is a little bit unclear. But they're not getting, Ultra intercepts saying, the Germans are doing this, so you can respond accordingly. They're sort of having to figure it out on their own. And I think that there's times when they are very concerned about what's going to happen. They're doing a deception in September 1945, Operation Bettenberg, which takes place in Luxembourg, south of Luxembourg City, between there, running through Bettenberg and down to Metz, in which they're impersonating the 6th Armored Division, and they're holding about 25 miles of line for George Patton's Third Army. And it's them and a few guys in a cavalry squadron. And they're supposed to do this for 3 or 4 days, but they can't free up real troops to put there because Patton's trying to hammer Metz. He's trying to get into Metz. And so it goes 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, 8 days. And they are getting very apprehensive. The German patrols are crossing the river in front of them. They're getting their communications wire cut. They can see that the enemy is moving into position in front of them. And the soldiers of this unit are pretty frightened. And it basically, they finally, on the 8th day, they get I think it's the 83rd Division comes in and takes over for them, and they can scoot away. But, if they'd been there a day longer, the Germans could have hit them. Same thing happened on December 15th, the big day in Luxembourg, the day before a big day, where they were finishing up a deception. They pulled out in the early morning hours of December 16th, and 3 or 4 hours later, the German attack comes. It would have totally hammered them. So, they maybe they got, secret intel that said, get the hell out of there. The Germans are going to be attacking, but I think more likely is they were just lucky. They could have taken horrific casualties. They did take casualties, but they took pretty light casualties. And I think that's a matter of luck and skill, in that they were projecting force, and so the enemy wasn't interested in attacking them.
Well, that brings up the question Bruce Day asked a couple of minutes ago. Did these guys ever draw fire? Were they bombed or strafed? And I suppose because there aren't that many of them, they are fairly mobile, in that a real armored division takes some time to bug out if they were under attack. But this unit, half tracks and trucks, I suppose if they were, they could pull out reasonably quickly. But what were the dangers they were facing? How close to the front line were they?
So it varied a lot. In Operation Breast, they were up about 400 meters from the front line. I mean, that is the closest that they really got as a group. In some operations, they were 10 miles behind the front line because they're making it seem like somebody's going into bivouac when they're really, they're going into a rest period when they're really about to attack. They took artillery fire, I think, about 8 times in about 8 different operations. They had 3 guys killed and maybe 30 or so wounded. The wounded question's a little bit interesting because they don't all get Purple Hearts. There's people that we know were wounded. They were hospitalized. They never got a Purple Heart, probably because of secrecy or because of the Army being the Army. I don't know. So I don't have an exact number of wounded, but I would say it's about 30. And hey, for 1,100 guys come out at the end of the war, you can say that's pretty good. If you're operating near the front line in at least a third of your missions, if you're fooling the enemy and you might have saved thousands of lives, okay, we'll take that number of casualties. I think that they were pretty lucky.
Brilliant stuff. So James is asking a question which opens up a bigger subject. Were any of the inflatables captured by the Germans? And it brings up the greater question of the fact that, as you said yourself, Rick, if the Germans find out that the Allies are tricking them, all works against you. Suddenly they now know that you're deploying tricks. And we were talking before going live about the fact that the Germans, before the Battle of the Bulge, were using audio deception themselves. Do we think they learned that from the Allies, or were they learning these things, independently?
No, so there's no evidence that the Germans, that I've ever found, that the Germans knew that the Ghost Army existed, that they knew what they were doing. And sonic deception certainly was kind of brand new because the equipment for doing it was brand new. No evidence that the Germans picked up on that. And I mean, if they did, they kept that very, very hush hush. And I don't think that they did. They did not capture any of the inflatables. There was there was one inflatable in Normandy that was captured by the 2nd Armored Division. That is to say that they were doing a deception, and somehow they had set up an inflatable tank, and the 2nd Armored guys came through, and that inflatable tank disappeared. And so they always believed that it had been taken by the 2nd Armored Division. And so maybe there were some soldiers in the 2nd Armored Division who were fooling around with their inflatable tank during the war. But, that was a lesson to them to tighten up on the security and make sure that they didn't lose any more tanks. And they did not.
Brilliant stuff. And another question from Jeff about, I get the sense the 23rd was more or less a gypsy unit, not necessarily reporting to anybody at the moment. Obviously, they were reporting to certain people, but with all these, and we didn't really expand on the fact is these artists and Hollywood, set builders and designers involved in this. How strict was military discipline within a unit of what was essentially craftsmen and artists and people who thought outside the box? Obviously, there's a rank structure, but it must have kind of been operating a little bit differently.
Oh, I absolutely think it was. And I think this is a fascinating question. And Jeff, thanks so much for asking it. I think, first of all, they are operating outside of the normal command structure, the normal chain of command. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops reports directly to 12th U.S. Army Group Headquarters. Right. So they're not going through division, corps, army. They are totally outside of all that. Inside the unit, there are definitely a lot of guys who are not super military in terms of their approach to going to war. But there's other guys, and sometimes there's conflict. There are officers who are super duper military, and they're getting pretty irritated at some of the soldiers who are a little more relaxed about it. And there's a lot of stories about kind of the conflicts there inside the unit. And eventually they kind of found a way to go along and get along, because honestly, once you were in this unit, you didn't really get out of it, because the Army didn't want to be transferring people who were in this secret unit and knew this secret deception thing and start putting them in other units. So you were pretty much stuck working together. And you had people who were military. You had Jewish soldiers who were working for people who were anti-Semitic. You had a lot of different dynamics there. And I remember talking to Arthur Shilstone, interviewing him, and he said the happiest day in my life was the day I got out of the Army. He said, it's not the day I got married. It's not the day my first son was born. It was the day I got out of the Army. I was so happy to do that. But now one thing, and I'm going to flip, I'm going to see if I can go forward in the slides here. I'm going to try to be more a little better about it. But one of the things that you touched on is that there are a lot of artists in this unit, and there are people from Hollywood and some people who've been in network radio and stuff. But the big thing is that there are artists, and the reason for that is that the unit that handled visual deception, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. It started as a camouflage unit. Well, if you're going to do camouflage, you want to have artists in it. And so about 40% of that unit was artists. So that's about 150 or so artists in this unit who are basically using all of their spare time to paint and sketch anything that they see. And this was, that painting on the left is a painting by John Jarvie. That was something I saw on the first day, in that first meeting in the coffee shop when I met his niece, Martha Gavin. There are thousands of these artworks, and some of them are in museums. The U.S. Army Art Collection has some of them. The National World War II Museum has some. Brown University has some. But a lot of them are still held by the families. And they're amazing because they really offer, I think, a unique perspective on the war. Photographs and movies are great. Artwork just gives you a little bit of another perspective, a little bit of dimension that maybe is missing in some of the other ones, a little bit of emotion of the person. The third from the left picture there of the little boy is called He Never Smiled. He was an orphan child at a party that they gave for orphans just before Christmas 1944, and he just sat there, this miserable little boy. They gave him a present. Nothing they could do could make him smile. And the soldier who sketched that, Victor Dowd, said, I wondered what his experience had been. What had he gone through that left him as this boy so traumatized. So you have these artists, and then some of them go on to become, I think I have the pictures here, some of them go on to become quite famous. And some of these names may or may not be familiar to your audience, but Bill Blass became a very famous fashion designer in the 1980s and 90s. And that's his wartime notebook. And in the upper left corner is his mirror image bees, which became the logo of his fashion empire 30 years later. Ellsworth Kelly, the very famous minimalist painter and sculptor, was in the unit. And if you are familiar with his modern work, which is all cubes or stripes, straight colors, this is very different. This is one of his wartime pieces of work. And Arthur Singer, famous, not as well known, but a wildlife artist. He illustrated the book Birds of the World, illustrated Birds of North America, created with his son the Birds and Flowers of the 50 States postage stamp series. So this is for me, Paul, this was a whole nother aspect of the story that if you go back to my work on this project, from the very first day, I had wow, this is this amazing deception unit that nobody knows about. And there's all these artists in it, and there's all this tremendous art, which is this great visual tool for a filmmaker, something to see. And so it was really a story that called out to be told.
Well, when you sent me the new copy of the book, or the updated version of the book, and I having read it, the first edition, and I didn't read it the second time. I just went through and looked at the pictures, and I had reminded myself what a visual treat it is, because, as I said, so many books. There are units written about books where literally 3 photos from the war exist, and that's it. So you get text, couple of photos, text. Your book is an amazing, and the documentary, amazing visual treat. And we'll deal with a couple of questions, because a couple of interesting points there about the sort of definition. James Murphy is saying, but this is the opposite to camouflage, in the sense that you're trying to make things that the enemy do see. There are times a camouflage unit are trying to hide things they don't want the enemy to see, and other times they're trying to make things that the enemy do see. So it gets a bit more complicated, doesn't it?
I think it's a mirror image of camouflage. I mean, it's the opposite, except you use you have sort of the same bring the same mindset to it. So if you're an artist and you're trying to hide something, you're trying to change the lines or change the visual so that you don't see this big thing there. And if you're now trying to make something else appear, you're going to again kind of think about the details. I mean, one of the things that they're given inflatable tanks, so they don't have to create the inflatable tank, but you can't just park an inflatable tank in the middle of a field and it's going to look real. So you got to sort of camouflage it, but then you want to camouflage it in such a way that maybe the enemy can see a part of it. And then, oh, by the way, it's an inflatable tank. Does it have tank tracks going to it?
Yeah.
Because, a 40-ton Sherman tank really leaves a heck of an impression in the ground. So a 90-pound dummy doesn't. But they had 3 guys with bulldozers who were part of a combat engineer company, and they, as the guys from the 603rd are inflating those tanks with air compressors, the guys with the bulldozers are carefully tracing the tracks out to them so that the following morning the enemy will see that. So and if you're doing an artillery piece, you should have spent shells around, you should have crates for ammunition around, you should have you've got to dig the revetments around the artillery piece. So they had to study how the real stuff was done and then sort of bring that to life with the fake ones. So I do think it uses the same visual tool set as camouflage. It just completely flips around how it does it.
Really good explanation there. I'll deal with a few more questions if you like, because they're good. And Peter O'Connell is saying, going back to sonic deception, given tight security imperatives, how did the Allies prevent Ghost Army loudspeaker operations from deceiving their own frontline troops?
They didn't. And we have often have testimony from other frontline American troops of believing that a division had moved in, that something was going on, because they heard the sounds of the inflatable tanks, of the sonic, the sound deception. And one of the things that happens in deception is that you don't tell American troops, hey, we're doing deception here, right? Because you don't want the secret to get out. You don't want people laughing about it, talking about it. Somebody gets captured and mentions it. So you just don't tell them. So everything these guys did was kept secret whenever possible from other American troops in the area. Now, sometimes they'd be working with some people, be working with a small number of troops. They would know what they're doing. But even then, they try to communicate the minimal amount of information. They didn't even really know what each other was doing. I mean, I don't think that I'm going off from your question a little bit, but I don't think the people in the unit really had the same idea of what they were doing that we have now, because they would be told, set up these inflatable tanks here or take them down here. And they weren't told anything about the sonic, anything about the radio, anything about what other people were doing. They each just kind of had their own job that they were fit into. And there's all sorts of stories of interactions with other American soldiers. Again, there was a soldier who was up near the front, and he was sketching actually a tree line, and the Germans were in the tree line, and a soldier from a real unit that was there came and said, "Get the hell down! This area's quiet here. If they see you there, they're going to start shooting." And Arthur's thought was, well, that's kind of why I'm here. I'm here to get them to start shooting at me. So what's the big deal? But the perspective of the real troops was very different.
Great little anecdote there. We've got some more questions coming in. And several people have asked about the state of German aerial reconnaissance. I mean, I said myself that we know the Allies took hundreds of thousands of aerial photos, and we of course talk about by the summer of 44, the German Luftwaffe is not where it was a few years ago. But from my understanding, it's one of the areas where the Germans still do have aircraft to take photos. Am I right on that?
Yeah. So it's a mixed. It's a little bit mixed. The Germans are still taking photos. There is still aerial reconnaissance, even as late as March 1945, when they do this Operation Viersen, which is why they're willing to put up all these inflatables. But the German aerial reconnaissance has gone down quite a bit. And so over the course of the war, in the 2 months before that, the use of inflatables was much less because German aerial reconnaissance was much less. But as you got close to the Rhine River, and there was this kind of pause and this buildup, the Germans were trying to figure out what was going on, and they managed to get their aerial photography out there. Now, the photo that we're seeing is taken from an American spotter plane. This is much lower than the Germans are going to get, because if a German plane was trying to fly in at this height, he'd be absolutely jumped on. And he'd have to be flying slower to get the pictures at that height, and he would just be hammered. So they're going to be much, much higher up. But this was, they put up their spotter planes to give this view so they could figure out, how does this look? Does it actually look like it's going to fool the enemy? Do we see anything that when they take their high level photograph down is going to be an obvious giveaway?
Great stuff. We've still got more questions coming in. I think we're getting towards the end of the hour now. We've got to bring up the elephant in the room, which is the success or otherwise of this. And a representative question from Jesse here: is there evidence from German intelligence reports they were actively deceived by these tactics, or was it more a case of use every means available to hope you gain an edge? I mean, we've kind of half covered that, but over to you.
Well, I think that there is evidence in very solid evidence in 2 or 3 operations that the Germans are buying the negative picture. Don't have a lot of evidence for most of the other operations. There's a few operations where it seems like the Germans aren't buying it. Not that they know that there's a deception there, but just that when they look at their whole where the troops are, that they just simply don't buy the idea that we're trying to put out of, say, the 2nd Armored Division being over here, but it's really over here. So, we have a few examples of knowing it worked, and you have some, I mean, you can judge this for what it is. You have some evidence by inference. So, in Operation Bettenberg, they're holding a 25-mile portion of Patton's line for 8 days. The Germans don't attack there. Do they not attack because they think that the American 6th Armored Division is there and they don't have the resources to do that? Do they not attack because they're basically still withdrawing and kind of damaged from having fled across France and not really getting it all together yet? I'm not sure I know the answer to that. So, I mean, if you succeed, you can kind of maybe assume that you succeeded because it worked, but that's not going to be true all the time. So the answer is mixed. We do have some evidence, and in that last deception, the one we're seeing here, definitely got captured maps, showed the 79th Division exactly where the Ghost Army was portraying it, which was 10, 12 miles away from where it really crossed the Rhine River. So that was a success. And at the same time, in that same mission, the intelligence showed German buildup across from where we were portraying strength. So the evidence is that we have is that it worked, but it's not completely conclusive evidence.
Which is basically...
Have I fudged that enough, Paul?
No, that's where you said you were going to go with this. I mean, this is a recurring theme on the channel where we try and assess some of these deception operations and even some of the special forces operations. How much success did they really have? And of course, you can't just measure it by a single metric. I mean, the Dambusters raid is an amazing example. The Doolittle raid are examples of things that militarily had a level of success that is ranking quite low, but in terms of morale for the country or bigger kind of geopolitical influence, they had a different effect. So there are more than one way of looking at this, and I think when you look at it, it does represent the inventiveness of the Allies. It does represent the out-of-the-box thinking that sort of starts as far up as Churchill and FDR, that permeated down through the military. That is one of the assets that helped the Allies win the war. I think I'm fairly stable ground saying that. But down to individual successes, as you said, it gets a bit more complicated.
Well, and I think that, one of the reasons that I set out, I've gone too far. One of the reasons that I set out to get this unit recognized today is because it felt to me like it was very successful. And yet they had gotten a letter of commendation for their last mission, but they'd never been officially recognized as a unit. And so we went out in 2015, I think it was, and started lobbying the U.S. Congress, which your audience may know. That's not an easy thing to do anymore. To award this unit a Congressional Gold Medal took us 7 years, and we could do a whole show just about that, Paul, and about the trials and travails of that.
Show,
long show. But in 2022, President Biden signed the legislation that had been passed to award this unit a Congressional Gold Medal, and I'm very happy to say that ceremony is coming up in about 6 weeks. It's in late March. We're going to have a few hundred family members, a few veterans in Washington, D.C. And we're going to be doing some other events surrounding the gold medal event at the Capitol. It's going to be an exciting time. So I'm really, we only have 7 veterans left out of the 1,100 who served in the unit, and I've gotten to know these guys over the years. I know that you've done this too. You've gotten to know a lot of World War II veterans who then have passed away. But it's been an honor to to advocate for their cause, and so I'm really excited that I think we're going to have 3 or 4 veterans there at the ceremony, and so we're honoring them before they're all gone. That means a lot to me.
Well, thank you for that, and a good reminder to folks to check you out, your website, your social media links, etc., so they can follow the progress of this, and they are in the description below. A couple of last questions.
Sure.
Norma, hello, Norma. How are you? Was it only in Northwest Europe? Was it used in Italy or the Southeast Asia Command? Now, I'll hand that to you.
Yeah. So one of the things that is interesting is that there was a sister deception unit, also part of the Ghost Army, I would say. I mean, that the Ghost Army is an unofficial name, so I can make anybody a part of it I want to.
It's your rules. Yeah.
But they're included in the gold medal legislation. The unit was the 3133rd Signal Service Company. So the 3132nd Signal Service Company is part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops there in Europe, in Northern Europe. The 3133rd is operating independently in Italy, and they're matched with a British unit that has inflatable tanks. So they are also carrying out multimedia deceptions, and they're involved in 2 deceptions along the Gothic line. So this is up in northern Italy, about on the level with Florence, something like that.
Yep.
And they are it's right at the end of the war. It's April 1945. These deceptions are really effective, and I haven't visited the spot yet, but I've been looking at some of the research recently, and I'm in touch with a lot more family members than I used to be. So there definitely is a story there that I would like to do more to tell. And then there were some deceptions, naval deceptions in the Pacific. I have really not looked much into that. I'm not aware of any ground deceptions, which would not have really made much sense in most of the islands because you had such a small area that you were attacking in. But they were planning on bringing the Ghost Army over, the 23rd, over to Japan, and they were all sent home for a month of vacay before you board up and head out to the Far East. And during that time, the atomic bomb was dropped, and there were no group of guys who were happier about that than the soldiers of the 23rd, because it meant that they didn't have to go to Japan.
Brilliant answer. We've got a couple of last questions, then we will wrap things up about the inflatables. So Bruce Day is saying, what were the largest inflatable decoys these guys use? And Lance is following up saying, were they M4s? Because it's the Shermans is the one, the image that does the rounds. It's on the cover of the book is the Sherman, but you showed some of the artillery pieces. So what was the biggest item in their kit bag?
Well, I think it was probably one of the tanks. This is an M4 Sherman. They also had an M7 Priest, which was a pretty sizable thing. Some of the artillery is pretty big. The anti-aircraft pieces, and they had I'm trying to remember what this is. This is an 80, 88.
A long Tom,
like
I think, isn't it? Is that a long
Maybe,
Tom?
yeah. But they had up to 200 something millimeter gun. They had pretty big artillery pieces, and of course those have you get the big barrels, so that becomes like a bigger thing. But in terms of volume, probably the tanks were like the biggest. I haven't actually measured to see which one would be the biggest. Let me stop. Let's say there is. I don't have a picture of it here, but there is an inflatable that they had. Let's see if I survive this. There is an inflatable that they had of a tank recovery vehicle. And there's one of these at the Bastogne Barracks. and I've seen them in a couple of other places, not inflatables, but the real ones. And this is basically a tow truck for tanks that you can pull up a couple of Sherman tanks onto this truck, and so it's a huge, trailered vehicle. And there is an inflatable of it. Now, I assume that they brought it to Europe. I haven't ever seen pictures of that inflated in Europe or heard anybody talk about it, but I've seen pictures of it inflated at Fort Belvoir in the U.S. when they were testing out their dummies. So I know they had it, and they may have brought that to Europe. So that would be bigger than the tanks even. That would be the biggest.
Well, thanks very much for that, Rick. I'm going to go to bed with the image of some poor GI hand blowing up an entire troop of Sherman tanks, like blowing up an inflatable to stay the night in a guest room. But I know it was done by compressor. I'm just being.
They said that, but they said that Jack Masey said, what did he say? They said, if things were going well, we used air compressors. If things were not going so well, we used bicycle pumps, and if things were going really, really badly, we used our lungs. So,
Mark 1 lung. Yeah, no, amazing stuff. So, Rick, I know you've got to go and do a meeting. Tell us what you do for those who don't know about your the show you host with Chris Anderson, and where they can find that.
Yeah, so we host a show called History Happy Hour, which is your not so dreaded competitor, and we interview authors much like you do, and we do it on Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern time, which is 9 p.m. London time. And I think this week we're interviewing an author about Fiorella LaGuardia, the wartime mayor of New York. And we have Joe Balkowski coming back on soon. And you can find us. I mean, we're on Facebook and YouTube, but the easiest way to find the show is to go to historyhappyhour.com. historyhappyhour.com. And yeah, thanks so much for mentioning that. You're up at like 1,000 episodes. We're at 185, and you're getting ahead of us further and further every week. So we'll never catch up.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, you've got staff. So I mean, you've got people who help you out. So I mean,
it's a huge staff. I mean, we're gonna have to move to the corporate headquarters. Is gonna, it's incredible.
It's you have to get an appointment to go to the History Happy Hour offices. Anyway,
I have to make an appointment to see myself. That's how crazy it is.
It's brilliant. I can't wait to see you in June or May when you come over to Normandy again, Rick. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great
I'll
to
put
see
the
you,
link
Paul.
to the shows in the script. Most of them are there already, but I'll add the others to it there. Good luck with everything that you're doing. See you in June. Folks, we're back again tomorrow, same time, same place. Don't change the channel. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.